Hi, and welcome to the NBA show. My name is Morten Jensen, and today we'll be discussing the Atlanta Hawks. Stay tuned. The Atlanta Hawks are picking up steam. They're 26-24 on the year, including 10-4 since the NBA All-Star break. The Hawks are rolling out a very, very deep roster, and it's translating into wins because they just keep having bodies to come off the bench who can produce at a high level. That matters, especially in the Eastern Conference, and right now they're in the thick of things in terms of being in the playoff picture. They have really been spry here in the second half of the season. A big part of that is also them getting healthy. They were hit with just an avalanche of injuries early on in the season. DeAndre Hunter, who played great at the start of the season, went down for an extended period of time, then returned for just 2 games, and then he went back out. Fortunately, word is that he will return at some point soon, but even so, that's just a huge loss. He's one of those 3-4 swing players who can really guard multiple positions. Hit the three, is an offensive weapon as well. That was a huge loss. And really, to hammer home the point here, there's only one guy on the entire Hawks roster who's played all 50 games, and that's Kevin Huerter. So the Hawks, despite not having great results initially early on in the season, that was in large part due to injuries. And now they have a lot of their guys back, still looking at a Hunter return, but it does stand to reason that because they have their guys back, they are playing better. One of the guys who also went out for an extended period of time early on in the season was Danilo Gallinari, one of their key free agent acquisitions during the offseason. He's back, he's playing well, much as we know him to do. So yes, the Hawks are picking up steam, but it is very much a result of them getting healthy. And when Hunter returns, look out. This team could get dangerous really quickly. Obviously, you cannot do an Atlanta Hawks video without talking about Trae Young, who once again has been phenomenal. His numbers are a little bit down compared to last year, but it doesn't really matter. He's been an engine. He's been their primary playmaker, primary scorer. He is taking less threes this year, and it seems like he's really trying to be a little bit more analytically inclined just in terms of how to pick his spots and where to shoot. There are a lot of this chess game thing going on with Trae. It seems like from this observer at the very least, he's playing a brand of basketball right now that's only going to encourage his career trajectory. He's going to be a star. He already is a star, but he's going to be one of those big timers that we're talking about in 20, 25, 30 years from now. He's just great, and the way that you can see him thinking out the game now, just compared to last year where he was chucking a little bit, in particular because he was dissatisfied with the organization. You know, he's coming around. He is really coming around now. It seems like for them to make the coaching change, for them to get a lot of able bodies in there to help him out with the scoring burden, he's playing now in a way that we kind of thought he would be after those initial hurdles had removed themselves. We're looking at a guy here who is understanding pace, time and score, situation. He can get to every spot on the floor that he wants to, and he's making the most of it. He's been just utter tremendous from an offensive perspective. Defensively, let's move on, shall we? So outside of Gallo, the Hawks obviously signed Bogdan Bogdanovic last offseason to a huge contract, and he's only played half the games. He's also been out with injuries. So like I said, just to reiterate, they've been hit bad. Bogdanovic is one of those guys who can play the 2 and the 3. He's an offensive initiator. He's a guy who can shoot from 3. He's particularly good from the mid-range area. And he is one of those guys who could really help them in the playoffs. He's really savvy. He's smart. He has great experience from overseas. He's a really good partner in crime for Trae Young because of his size, his athleticism, his IQ. There's a lot to like here from Bogdanovic, and the hope is that he just stays healthy throughout the rest of this year. We're looking at a guy who's shooting over 38% from downtown, 90 from the line. He's highly efficient, and in terms of him being a secondary ball handler, you can argue if that's the right role, but he is certainly an upgrade over Kevin Huerter as a play initiator, as someone who handles the basketball, as someone who can create their own offense. He is absolutely better in that regard. And that also makes me ask a question about the core moving on, because when you look at this roster, which is absolutely loaded, and I haven't even touched on Clint Capella, John Collins, and Onyeka Okongwu yet, what is their next step here? So for example, they acquired Lou Williams at the trade deadline. Lou is on the old side. He's in his mid-30s. Gallo is 32, going to be 33. Bogdanovic is going to be 29. And then we have Trey, who's 22. So you're looking at some age disparity here, and you have to wonder, is this team built for the now, or is it built for the future with Trey? Because the presumption here is that neither Gallo or Bogdanovic or Lou Williams are going to be big players a couple of years from now when Trey hits his prime years. In which case, what can you do? Because you can't really pivot off of those pieces a couple of years from now. Their value is going to be incredibly low. So are you potentially looking at a consolidation move after the conclusion of this season going into the offseason? Some of you might be wondering, what is a consolidation move? In short, it's basically a 2-for-1 or a 3-for-1. You take a group of players who are very much capable, and then you group them together for maybe one player or two players. You basically turn more into less, but that less is better in terms of quality. A comparison could be when the New York Knicks gave up Danilo Gallinari and a ton of assets for Carmelo Anthony back in the day. They consolidated, they had a lot of trade chips, and they cashed in for Melo. That's a way you can do things as well here. Now the Hawks have Cam Reddish, who's young. He's very inefficient, but there is still some intrigue. He's a 6'8" long wing with ball handling capabilities and defensive upside. Teams would be interested in him. They have Okongwu, who's a rookie center out of USC. Really just projects as a great defender, but they already have Clint Capella playing his minutes. So you can group those two together with, for example, Bogdanovic or Gallinari, someone else, and maybe make a play for a potential superstar or someone close to that ilk. Now, I'm not saying that this is realistic, but I do think the Hawks could present the Washington Wizards with a very interesting and intriguing offer for Bradley Beal if push came to shove. You could also add in Kevin Huerter in that deal. There's so many components here at play. Depth gives you the luxury of pulling off consolidation trades. It gives you the luxury of having extra negotiation power because you can keep throwing bodies into that deal. So the Hawks have a lot of different angles that they can play here in the upcoming offseason. It just depends on whether or not they're ready to pivot, or maybe they just stick with what they have, make the playoffs, see how far they can go this year and next year, and then from there, who knows? Now, there's really no need for me to get into all the John Collins talk. Once again, I've been talking about him plenty on this channel, but there is one little subplot that I want to bring up. There's actually reason in sticking with him, even if it does mean matching a max offer sheet, which I almost have to assume that he's getting at this point from someone like the Knicks or someone else out there that has just a ton of cap space. You can keep him also for the entire purpose of trading him later. He's so young, he still has value. So if you lock him up on a max deal, it's not the end of the world. A lot of teams would still be interested. So he could be an additional component that you add to a consolidation trade if you want to. Now, yes, you would be giving up youth in that regard, just as you would with Cam Reddish or Kevin Huerter. And at which point you also have to wonder, how old are we going to get? Because Trey, like I said, is just 22. There are a lot of these back and forth discussions that I have to assume the Hawks are having right now because of the age disparity all over. But there's no doubt that Collins would make an interesting, if not intriguing, trade piece, even on a max deal. It's also worth noting that his role moving forward might be more limited, so it would make sense to hang on to him for maybe half a year, then flip him at next year's NBA trade deadline, and then pivot on to Capella, Okongwu, make DeAndre Hunter the full-time 4, stick with Reddish. Maybe he gets better in year 3, stick with Herter, although he's soon to be up for an extension. So there are definitely some components here that could pivot into the youth area as well, while ironically sacrificing youth via Collins. It's a little bit funky, but you know what? The Hawks is a funky roster. They have guys of certain age groups all over. And I think that is really interesting to some capacity, because for a win now team, you're pretty much settled in because you have productive young players, you have guys in their primes, and you have guys past their primes, but all of them are still productive on some level. And you have that luxury when you have someone like Trae Young, who is essentially averaging, 26 and 10 as a 22-year-old, that you don't have to look at him as a 22-year-old, at least a typical one, because his production is that of a seasoned veteran. That means you're not necessarily in a rush to go pivot towards more youth. You know he's producing at a certain level, you can utilize that. So if you have guys in their prime who are able and willing to produce at a high level, you can certainly play that card as well. So out of fear of repeating myself, the Hawks just have a lot of versatility, both on the court, off the court, in trade possibilities. They can pivot to being older, they can pivot to being younger. Either way, it would kind of work because they already have their point guard of the future who's producing like he's been in the league for 10 years. They can go with a guy like Bradley Beal, who's in the middle of his prime. Like there aren't really any stopgaps here for the Hawks, which does make their front office job a little bit more interesting because they don't have the same limitations as a team like Orlando would, which is rebuilding and is primarily looking at youth. This is a team that can look in any other direction, and if a deal makes sense, they can go get it. Remember, teams don't have to build off of age constructions just because one of their guys is of a certain age group. It all depends on production, it depends on team chemistry. There are so many sub-layers to how you construct a roster. And for the Hawks, they have just hit on a lot of their draft picks. They've hit on free agent signings. They've hit on a lot here. I mean, there's a reason that John Collins is attractive to a lot of teams, even if he isn't necessarily one of those new age 4s. He's productive. Trae Young, productive. Kevin Huerter, productive. DeAndre Hunter, productive. Cam Reddish, that remains to be seen. But the Hawks have hit on their draft picks. And look, it wouldn't surprise me if Onyeka Okongwu is also going to be a big factor over the next couple of years, even with Clint Capella, who, by the way, is averaging 15 and 14 in under 30 minutes per game. He's doing so great. I mean, I really should have devoted an entire segment to him, but Clint Capella, man, he's just been a force in the middle for them. He's young enough to build around in terms of pairing him with Trae Young for the long haul. The Hawks just have so many things working for them because of their roster, because they've hit on draft picks, because they've made the right decisions in free agency. You really have a team here that can decide themselves what kind of path they want to walk. And the best thing about it is, regardless of what they end up doing, they have proven to be able to hit in the draft, which means if push comes to shove and they have to play the draft game once again, they certainly have a very, very stable track record. And that should help them continuing to build this team for the future if need be. I don't think they're there. I think Trae Young and the rest of the roster wants to win. I think that's the priority right now. I think that's what they're looking for. But ultimately, it's just a nice component to have. And it also raises this one final point. Should the Hawks become one of those perennial playoff teams that finishes in the top 5 in the East every single year and they're picking low in the draft, for them to be able to have a steady scouting staff and a steady drafting staff that can get you rotational players late in the first round or even in the second, don't underestimate just how huge a component that could be for their future. The Hawks are set up right, regardless of their situation. there are not a lot of teams in the NBA I could say that about.